As I was sitting here about to read a passage of scripture for my morning prayer, I had this thought, and I wanted to quickly record as I hash some of this out because I haven't yet. There's this saying or this thought that we are to submit to the truths of scripture, and I believe that. I think the scriptures are inspired and for us in many ways, and there's truths and there's doctrine there that we are to believe. Now, one thought that I had was the first thought that I had was this. Here's a good question to ask. What am I believing in scripture that I wish I didn't have to believe? What am I believing in scripture that I wish I didn't have to believe? And I think this is a good question. It just kind of popped into my head. This is a good question to ask ourselves, because this would almost be kind of a litmus test of, am I submitting myself to scripture and some doctrine and to God? Or am I just believing things that make me comfortable and happy at the end of the day? And I don't really know how to think about this, because right after I had that thought of that question, I have to ask myself, in some ways, how do you even know what to believe? Because you're having to process these things in your own mind. I'm not sure how to hash this out completely. It made me think of it. It's actually making me think of a post yesterday that I read from an Eastern Orthodox, and it was basically saying, how are you to understand scripture without the church explaining to you what that scripture has always meant to the church? And I thought that was a really good idea. I think that's a really good thought, because if one passage of scripture says something, that thought from the Eastern Orthodox is simply, well, we aren't to just read that passage and think, well, what does this mean to me? But we are to read that passage and ask, what has this passage always meant to the church? How has the church always interpreted this passage? And I think that helps a lot, because that puts us under an authority of the church, especially if the church has a history of teaching this same doctrine over time. And I think that's it's a really strong argument for the Catholic faith, the Orthodox faith, some other probably Protestant traditions, but not a lot of them, I wouldn't think, because they really can't be traced all the way to the beginning. Lutherans would probably be close, but again, I don't know. I think it's just a good thought to have. What am I believing that I wish I didn't have to believe? I think a good one is the Eucharist, to be honest. And I say that only because it was just on this other page. And it was probably just in the top of my head. The Eucharist, for example, I wish I didn't have to believe it was the body and blood of Christ, let's say. But the church has always taught the Eucharist in that way. So from the first century on, there are writings, there are fathers that are teaching the Eucharist in a way that says, no, this is the actual body, this is the actual blood, or truly body, truly blood. And the church has always believed that. And now today in 2026, we're thinking, gosh, I wish I didn't have to believe that, because that just sounds really weird. So now that is me submitting myself under the authority of Scripture and church, because they've always taught it that way. It's not in my authority to read that passage and think something otherwise, I guess. So I don't know. That's just some random thoughts for this morning as I was reading. What do you think? What do you think about the question, what am I believing that I wish I didn't have to believe? And what do you think about this idea of reading Scripture, and instead of trying to figure out what it means, first and foremost in my own head or in your own interpretation, looking at the church to see what they've always taught that it meant? And I'm not just talking about Reformation either, because that's 500 years of history, and there's rich history in the last 500 years, of course. I'm talking about the last 2,000 years, and especially the first 500 to 1,000 years. What did the church teach about these things? So give me your thoughts.